details around the newly passed by City Council parking laws
Yes,
and how specifically they may affect our reviews. Yep.
absolutely. So if you remember, back in December of last year, the City Council referred to you a draft local law amending the off-street parking requirements for the city that pretty dramatically changed the concept of how we regulate parking in the city of Beacon. So instead of having parking minimum requirements, the local law established maximum parking requirements in certain districts and sort of a range of parking requirements in other districts. So the City Council received your comments from your review of that local law back in December, and they continued to review the local law until last month when they finally adopted it at the beginning of August. So the off-street parking local law is adopted. It's been filed with the Department of State. It is now effective. So I thought now would be a good time to kind of go through what it is that actually ended up in the final draft and how it affects your reviews. So and I should also mention, if you look for the local law on E-codes to access the Beacon City Code, it's not in the text of the code itself. You have to look at that separate little button that says New Laws. So it hasn't been folded into the code itself yet by general code. So, as I mentioned, the local law does create maximum parking standards in some zoning districts and then a range for others. So in the CMS, the Linkage District, and the Waterfront Development District, there's no minimum parking requirement unless otherwise determined by the planning board. There's just a maximum. In all the other districts, there's a range. The local law also eliminated that 1964 parking exemption that we see every once in a while on applications. That was the exemption that basically said if your proposed use is 25% or less more intensive than the use that existed in 1964, then you don't have to provide any parking.
That's gone.
So that's gone, completely gone. So applicants would have to research what was the use in 1964 and look through all of the historical documents and figure that out. That is no longer the case. The local law also increased landscaping requirements within parking areas. And this is an important one. It requires now green stormwater practices for parking areas other than single-family and two-family homes. If you remember, actually, that was one of your comments back to the City Council, that to impose green stormwater practices on single-family and two-family homes would be very onerous because of the maintenance requirements. And it also provides a little more flexibility. The original local law just called for pervious surfaces in parking areas. Now there's like a whole range of different types of green stormwater practices that can be implemented, and it's, there's a lot more flexibility.
Just curious, how does that differ from some of the requirements I've seen applicants in the past on large-scale developments adhere to relative to capture and then filter and then discharge?
John Russo can probably better explain this than I can, but there are just sort of capturing the water and slowly releasing it. That's sort of one of the more standard methods, but it's really
would be infiltration type systems, infiltrating the water back into the ground, where others you're capturing the quantity, you're treating it for quality, and you're releasing it at a controlled rate. Here, we're trying to recharge the groundwater, infiltrate it back. You may be capturing it and using it for watering your flowers and using it for other things such as that. Reuse of it.
Go ahead, sorry. So some of the examples in the local law is use of permeable pavement, bioretention, tree pits and urban forestry, stormwater planters, rain gardens, vegetated swales, stormwater harvesting and reuse, which is what John just mentioned.
Okay. It's good.
Yeah,
More of a soft end as opposed to.
I see.
right. That's a good way to put it. So I thought we'd kind of go through the local law section by section and just kind of highlight where it is that, there's hard and fast requirements and where the planning board has discretion when you're reviewing a site plan. So the local law starts out by basically saying that you can't get a permit unless you have compliant parking, standard requirement. The local law then discusses the location, use, design, construction, and maintenance of parking facilities. And a lot of these provisions are the same as what they were in the previous version with some tweaks. For example, for location, the code requires that parking facilities have to be provided on the same lot as the use for which they're serving, unless you have off-street parking facilities for structures and land uses on 2 or more contiguous lots. So if you have 2 neighboring lots that want to share a parking area, you can have one of those lots have the parking area on the lot for the other one to access in a single common facility. And of course, there, we would need to make sure that there was an easement or deed restriction to allow for that access in perpetuity. In any residence district, there is no parking allowed in the front yard, beyond the front plane of the building. You see that a lot in your applications. I know we talk about that a lot. The building inspector, when it's just subject to a building permit, or the planning board, when it's before you, can waive that requirement if there's some sort of unusual lot configuration that would require some flexibility for that standard.
Are there exceptions for front setback parking, certain zones?
For parking, you are allowed, you are allowed to, not in certain zones, but anywhere, in any residence district, you're allowed to have,
In any residence district?
you're allowed to waive that restriction against
Yeah.
having parking in the front yard if there's some unusual lot configuration that's necessitating it. So it's not just on any standard lot, but where there's
Could be a
a
narrow
particular,
I should ask my question differently
Circumstance.
or better. Are there any non-residential zones where front setback parking is allowed or is able to be considered? I'm just curious.
that is a
I would
good
think the
question.
key.
That's,
Yeah.
I'm thinking of specific
Yeah, I
instances where
think
that's
the-
being requested.
Yeah, I think it's just in the residential districts where it's prohibited.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay, that helps.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, this provision itself is specific to the residence
Residents,
districts. yeah.
gotcha, okay.
Let's see. So the code also provides that with respect to parking in residential districts, you're also not allowed to have parking in the side yard or rear yard that's next to a street. And otherwise, you need a 5-foot setback for parking facilities.
Wait, can you repeat that? So if it's in a side yard adjacent to a street, you need 5 feet setback?
You're not
Or
allowed to
not.
have the parking
Oh.
in a side yard or a rear yard that is adjacent to a street.
So
But
if
where you
a
have
corner, if you have a corner lot.
like a corner lot, yeah.
Yeah.
Or if it's like a through lot, and the lot has, the rear yard also is adjacent to a street, you can't have your parking facilities in that rear yard next to the
Makes
street.
corner lots rather yeah.
The local law keeps the standard size of the parking spaces at 9 by 18. Here, though, you do have some discretion. So you can reduce the size of the parking stalls to 8.5 by 18, except in the CMS district specifically for employee parking. So you can squeeze in probably a couple more spaces. You also have the discretion to allow for up to 30% of the parking spaces being provided to be compact spaces.
8.5 is characterized as compact?
It doesn't specify what compact is. The 8.5 by 18 is for employee parking.
I see.
And you can reduce the size of the parking stalls for that purpose, but then otherwise, up to 30% of the parking spaces can be compact spaces, whether it's for employee or guests of the site.
Is there any provision for charging stations at all?
No,
Yeah,
no,
just curious.
there is
Okay.
not. But that's certainly something that, can be discussed during site plan review.
Yeah.
Let's see, where a parking space is bordered by a wall or a column, whether it's on a surface parking lot or in a garage, the space has to be at least 10 feet by 18 feet. You also have to have at least 24 feet of a maneuvering area for cars to access each spot. But here this is another place where you have discretion, you can approve a lesser width where you have parallel or angled parking spaces, and I think we'll see that in one of the applications that we have on the agenda tonight. Landscaping. So here, this is an important section that the city council increased the landscaping requirements. So the requirement is that all off-street parking areas have to be landscaped with appropriate trees, shrubs, and other plant materials and ground cover. And you have some discretion here as far as like what that landscaping looks like, what kind of plant materials are provided. The consideration that is folded into the code is to assure the establishment of safe and convenient and attractive parking, but to provide a minimum amount of maintenance. So including maintenance of the plant materials, giving snow plowing consideration, removal of leaves and other debris. So taking into consideration, maybe not an oak tree that's gonna, drop huge heavy leaves over the parking area, but maybe some other species. And I'm sure Karen can think of a lot of really good
I just
parking
whispered in her
lot
ear.
trees.
We're going to rely on her heavily for that.
Yes. There is a requirement to have at least one tree for every 8 spaces within the parking area, and that tree has to be at least 3 inches DBH, diameter at breast height. However, you do have the discretion here to require less trees, to allow for less trees in the parking lot if there are site constraints in the parking area that don't allow for the required number of trees. As an alternative, you could require a set-aside of an equivalent number of trees and landscaping elsewhere on the same lot. So whatever trees would have otherwise been required in the parking lot, you can require the applicant to put those elsewhere on the site.
Jennifer, does it say
Yeah.
where the trees have to be planted in the parking lot? Is it on the outskirts of it, or is it every 8 spaces and then a space has to be dedicated to landscaping and a tree, or?
With respect to the one tree every 8 spaces, it doesn't say specifically. However, the next section that we're going to go over talks about planting islands. So wherever possible, the planning board is supposed to require planting islands that are at least 8 feet wide, and provide a guide to vehicle movement. So that would be one spot where the tree for every 8 spaces could go. You can require curbing. There's also a provision in here that provides a certain area that needs to remain clear for driveway sight distance. And then we talk about drainage and stormwater with respect to parking areas. So all parking areas are required to provide some type of management of stormwater pursuant to the code. It says that the stormwater areas have to be in compliance with the New York State Stormwater Management Design Manual, or Chapter 190 of our code, which is the stormwater chapter, or a method otherwise acceptable to the city engineer. Let's see, there's a drainage analysis that needs to be provided that has to account for pre- and post-development conditions, and also discuss remediation or mitigation for stormwater runoff. Maximum slope within a parking area can't exceed 5%. And here is where, this is a new provision in the code that we just mentioned at the top of this conversation, that except for one-family and two-family dwellings, the planning board shall require green stormwater infrastructure for the development of parking spaces. There is a sort of a relief valve there, and that is that unless the applicant establishes to the planning board's satisfaction that the underlying soils don't allow for natural drainage. So if the site is, 100% clay, or, just doesn't provide the type of soils for infiltration, then the applicant would not be required to do the green stormwater
Still required
practice.
to do some sort of stormwater, but not green.
Yes, not green, yeah.
Is a Coltech, those structures, are those considered green?
Yes, you can use them in both ways. You can actually wrap the system in plastic, and so it doesn't infiltrate, or you can use them as infiltration systems. But down in Main Street, in a lot of these areas, I know there's a lot of clay. From all the infrastructure work we've done, it's pure clay.
But those work in clay soils, right? They're just expensive.
Water doesn't infiltrate in clay soils regardless of what type of
Oh,
system
really?
you're
Okay,
using.
okay. Even if there's like a input gravel bed that's.
It can't go through.
It can't go through it, okay,
Just can't get through the clay.
gotcha.
So the code does still provide for shared parking, which we've used on several applications over the past few years, where you have two or more uses on the same lot, but the demand for the uses varies. So like if you have a residential use and an office use on the same lot, the people that live there likely won't be there in the day when the office users are there, and then vice versa. So you're allowed to approve the joint use of parking spaces that are less than the total capacity that would otherwise be required by code.
Under legit, non-simultaneous uses.
Right.
Yeah.
There is a provision that discusses alternatives to providing parking spaces. One would be a conveyance of land. So where the planning board determines that because of either size limitations, dimensions, topography, et cetera, that an applicant in a business district where it's impractical to provide parking for either all or a portion of the otherwise required spaces, and there is land to give to the city, basically, the applicant can use that option to permanently dedicate use of their land to the city for commercial parking purposes. So that's one option. I don't think I've ever seen that provision utilized. I don't think I've ever seen that one utilized. But it's there.
Just in case.
Just in case. And then we have land bank parking, which you have used on applications in the past, where you can waive the initial improvement of the parking spaces up to 50% of the parking spaces. They have to be shown on the plan, but they can remain as green space until they're actually needed. And hopefully they're never actually needed, but they're
Yep.
planned out and mapped there in case they are.
Up to 50%, no more than 50%.
No more than 50%, yeah.
You answered one of my questions.
And then we get into the parking standards. So this is probably where the code has changed most significantly to provide for parking maximums for all uses with no minimums. One of the things that you all commented on when you reviewed the draft was the provision in here that talked about a professional parking study and the use of that parking study to demonstrate what the appropriate number of parking spaces on the site would be. That provision is still in here. It's changed a little bit. It does say that any professional parking study submitted by the applicant shall be based primarily on specific site-related information, a comparable analysis of similar uses and properties in the area or region, and an examination of demand reduction strategies, including such elements as promotion of walking, bicycle parking, storage facilities, alternative mobility options, transit access opportunities, car share, ride share, or carpooling. So it gives you flexibility in reviewing these parking studies, but indicates that the parking study has to be based primarily on local numbers, not primarily based on the ITE standards, the national standards. You really want to see the local information. So with respect to the CMS district, the linkage district, and the waterfront development district, there is a maximum number of parking spaces that are allowed. And if you recall, in the old version of the code, in the parking schedule, you had a really specific list of uses. So, you know, restaurant would be one particular standard for parking, office, service uses. Now there's only there's 5 use categories instead of the pages upon pages of use categories. There's residential, lodging, commercial, healthcare and educational, and industrial. So for each of those 5 use types, there's a standard provided. For residential, it's 1 space per dwelling unit. Lodging is 3/4 of a space per guest room. Commercial is 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet of GFA. Healthcare and educational is 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet of GFA. And industrial actually has no maximum. An applicant could come to you and propose less than what the maximum is, and it would be up to the planning board to determine is what the applicant's proposing as far as the number of parking spaces for each of those categories appropriate for that site and appropriate for the use. If the applicant proposes more than the maximum, they have to get a variance. If the applicant proposes something other than what you've determined is the appropriate number of spaces for that site and that use, they have to get a variance from that requirement that you have set. So it's much different than how we've looked at parking in the past.
So one of my questions in relationship to this maybe is this effectively takes out of play this whole waiver scenario we used to deploy.
Sort of, except you're kind of determining what the requirement is. So,
That's then my next question,
Yeah.
right? So one would assume, you know, an applicant would come before us with, you know, what their approach to their parking needs are and have some basis for that. And
Yeah.
that it has to meet some form of, I guess, logic as determined by the planning board? Is there,
yeah, so there is sort of a standard. There's a lot of considerations, but it does say that the planning board shall determine the appropriate number of off-street parking spaces within the range provided in the table in the code. And it's based on the context of the property. And there's a whole list of considerations for you to think about when you're figuring out whether it's within the context of based on the context of the property. And that includes the size of the parcel, the proposed uses, existing buildings on the parcel, availability of public and street parking in the area, access to public transit. A parking study is something that you would consider, shared parking, land banking, ADA compliance, and input from public hearing. So there's a lot of sources of
Yeah,
information
okay.
to think about when you're determining the standard. So we talked about the CMS, the linkage, and the waterfront development district as far as the maximums go. In all of the other zoning districts, so all your residential districts, the LI, the Fishkill Creek Development District, the general business, T district, there's a range. So there is a minimum number provided, but there's also a maximum. And within that range is where you would determine what the appropriate number of spaces is for that site. Let's see. What else is of note? I think that kind of hits the highlights of the local law. One other, actually, there's something that was added to the local law. This is not codified, but it's in the local law that was adopted. And that is the city council's request for a report from the planning board. So it says that the planning board is requested to provide a summary of the effects of implementation of this local law to the city council within 1, 2, and 3 years of adoption, and to provide this information, including but not limited to the number of applications in each zoning district, the required number of parking spaces for each application, the number of parking spaces an application would have been required to provide prior to this local law, so under the prior version of our code, and any other information that you deem relevant to the city council. So
I nominate Kevin to write that. I'm
So,
assuming we're tasking
this is
our-
something, yeah, that we'll have to, keep in mind as we're going through applications, and let's see, 1, 2, and 3 years after adoption. So next August, we'll have to send a report along to the city council that collects that data and provides that information to them.
Well, do we do that? Do we collect them on the projects that we have approved and after they've been built?
Well, this is just the number of applications that
Number of applications.
in each zoning district. So how many applications in the next year will you have reviewed in the T district? How many applications in the CMS? And then what the required number of parking spaces was for each of those, and what would it have been
Gotcha.
under the old code?
That's the part that would take some work.
Yeah.
It could be a little fuzzy, but I'm assuming we'll put in place a mechanism for that tracking mechanism.
Yeah, well, as staff.
If we
your
put
staff
something in the
consultants
minutes every
will
time we
work
do
on
it.
that.
Me? Oh, I turned it off. I turned it off to cough, and I never turned it back on.
I love that idea of tracking
Yeah.
data, and we should probably make a habit of it. It exists, right? It just needs to be tracked and reported. I think it'd be really useful and instructive.
So good, you're going to write the report. I nominated.
If I had data, it's easy.
Awesome. A real quick question. So we
Yeah.
talked a little bit about waivers. So that whole scenario is just different, and especially as it relates to this maximum provision.
Yeah, so like the waivers that you would see in the CMS district and the linkage district
They kinda go
now,
away.
where, exactly, they're no longer
That's
in the
good.
code.
That's good.
Yeah.
And then my only other question, and you may have touched on it, but I'm not sure, and that's what sort of prompted the question, is just this concept of, as we've seen in other site-constricted applications in the past, this idea of off-site parking. Does anything change in the new law relative to this idea of, an applicant choosing within an 800-foot radius other possible options for parking for their development?
So the requirement is that it has to be on a contiguous site. If it's going to be off-site, it has to be a contiguous.
Oh, so it does change that.
Well, that wasn't an official, that was part of the process of justifying lower, right? Using a study to justify providing less parking on site.
Yeah, I guess. I'm assuming that mechanism was built into the law somehow. Right, I'm thinking of this recent
1113.
example. Yeah, 1113.
Right,
Oh,
we're looking at just the available.
Yeah, so they actually, they had the 1964 parking exemption. So they actually weren't, at the end of the day, because they had reduced the like, density, I'll call it, of the application, they got to the point where they qualified for the 1964 parking exemption. So I think they were providing 30 or so spaces on site.
Yep.
That was more than they were actually required to provide. But then you had the analysis under the special permit of, is the use creating a parking issue, a burden on the local streets? And that's where the off-site locations came into play, because they had to demonstrate that there was sufficient parking in
Right.
the area to accommodate the
That happened on
use.
Schenck as well.
Yeah, it happened a few times.
It's
Yeah.
a simpler example.
So-
On Skink, there was no real space to put any parking,
Yep.
and they did the 800-foot radius
Which
analysis.
we're quite
Right.
optimistic.
Yeah, it happened on Cross to some degree, too. So how does this new law then alter that potential scenario?
Because
future.
well, first of all, the 1964 parking exemption is gone.
Right.
And you basically set what the parking requirements are for the particular use on the particular site within that range.
Yep.
Whether it's 0 to the maximum in the CMS linkage and WD district, or within the prescribed range.
So then, for all
And the
intents and
other
purposes,
districts.
I guess what I'm hearing is that if the proposed parking, or at least the planning board and applicant determined appropriate amount of parking for the application isn't available on site,
Yeah.
then this concept of looking elsewhere for other parking to make up the requirement is now gone. Yes?
So, yes, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
They would have to seek a variance.
Thank you.
In that
That's
instance,
super
yeah.
helpful. Okay.
Yeah.
That's very
That-
clear.
That is clear. It changes things quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's streamlined.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's good. Well, thank you.
you're welcome.
Any other, before, we're at 7:30, but any other quick questions for Jennifer? Awesome.